Modern survival experts tried recreating authentic Viking winter techniques. 3 of them nearly died, not from the cold, but from doing the one thing every survival guide tells you to do. Turns out the Vikings knew something we've somehow forgotten. Vikings didn't build homes, they built survival machines. And honestly, most of what you learned in school about how they lived through winter is either wrong or missing the good parts. Let's start with the longhouse. These weren't just big wooden buildings, they were partially buried into hillsides. Why? Because dirt doesn't care if it's -20 outside. The earth itself acted as insulation, keeping temperatures stable when the wind was trying to murder everyone. Now here's what I find fascinating. Those curved walls you see in reconstructions, not decorative, not some artistic Viking choice. Those curves deflected Arctic winds better than flat surfaces ever could. We're talking up to 30% less heat loss. These people were engineering solutions 1,000 years before anyone called it engineering. The ceilings were kept deliberately low, not because Vikings were short, they weren't actually, but warm air rises, and if your ceiling is 20 feet up, congratulations. You're heating empty space while your family freezes at ground level. One central hearth could warm a 75-foot longhouse. That's longer than most modern homes are wide. But here's the trade-off nobody mentions in textbooks. No chimneys, zero. Everyone breathes smoke, constantly. Archaeologists examining Viking remains keep finding severe lung damage. Black lung wasn't just a coal mining problem. These people traded respiratory health for not freezing to death. Fair deal? I'd probably make the same choice. And speaking of things that sound insane but worked brilliantly, those turf roofs, the ones that look like someone just threw grass on top and called it a day, they provided insulation comparable to modern fiberglass. The grass roots created natural waterproof seals. Meanwhile, I can't keep my basement from leaking with actual modern technology. The average longhouse packed 30 to 50 people inside. Plus, livestock. Yes, cows and sheep lived in the house, with the humans on purpose. Sounds disgusting, right? Well, those animals weren't pets. They were basically living space heaters that also produced food. And that's where things get really interesting. They slept with their cows on purpose. Not next to them, not in a nearby barn. Under the same roof, separated by walls barely waist high. Sounds disgusting, right? Well, here's the math that made Vikings geniuses. A single cow produces roughly 1,000 BTUs per hour. That's basically a space heater running 24/7, for free. No wood needed, no maintenance. Just feed the thing some hay and collect your warmth. Now multiply that by 10 or 15 animals. Vikings positioned their sleeping platforms along the walls closest to the livestock section, not the fire. And that seems backwards until you realize something crucial. Fire needs constant feeding. You fall asleep, it dies, you wake up freezing at 3 in the morning. Cows, they just keep radiating heat, whether you're awake or not. The byre section of every longhouse held cattle, sheep, and goats. Low walls let that animal warmth flow directly into living quarters like the world's smelliest central heating system. But let's be honest about the trade-off here. You're living with the smell, the flies, the constant noise, and diseases that jump between species. My neighbor complains when my dog tracks mud inside. Vikings had livestock defecating 15 feet from their dinner table. Here's where it gets interesting, though. This setup actually made them tougher. Vikings developed serious immune resistance to animal-borne pathogens, diseases that would later devastate populations encountering livestock for the first time. Vikings had been building immunity for generations. The real danger wasn't getting sick from your animals, it was losing them. When cattle died during harsh winters, families often didn't survive either, and not from starvation first, they froze, because they just lost their heating system. Historical records show entire households perishing within weeks of losing their livestock to disease or cold. Makes you appreciate that cow smell a bit more, doesn't it? So they had the warmth figured out. Animals inside, humans toasty. But warmth means nothing if you freeze the second you step outside. And Vikings spent hours outdoors daily, working in conditions that would send most of us running for the nearest heated car. Their clothing was basically a science project that modern outdoor brands are still trying to copy. Viking sheep weren't the fluffy cotton balls you see on farms today. These were bred for dual coat fleeces. The outer layer had coarse fibers that shed water like a raincoat. The inner layer was soft down that trapped body heat. One sheep, two completely different materials. Pretty clever for people who supposedly just hit things with axes. And here's where it gets interesting. They deliberately left the lanolin in their wool. You know that greasy stuff modern manufacturers wash out to make clothing softer? Vikings kept it. Why? Because lanolin is naturally waterproof. Getting caught in freezing rain wearing treated Viking wool was uncomfortable. Getting caught in that same rain wearing washed wool was potentially fatal. But the real genius was layering. Linen went against the skin because it wicks moisture away from your body. Wool went in the middle because those air pockets trap warmth. Fur faced outward to shed snow and sleet. 3 layers, 3 specific jobs. Modern mountaineering gear uses this exact same principle, except we charge $200 for a jacket and act like we invented something. Now, that fur trim around hoods and cuffs? Not fashion. Those fluffy edges created turbulent air barriers that prevented body heat from escaping at openings. Wind hits smooth fabric and slides underneath. Wind hits fur and gets scattered in every direction. Your neck stays warm, your wrists stay warm, you don't die. A single cloak could take over 40 hours to make. Spinning the thread, setting up the loom, weaving the fabric, finishing the edges. That's a full work week for one piece of clothing, which explains why cloaks showed up in wills right next to swords and land. Losing your cloak wasn't just inconvenient, it was losing weeks of labor and possibly your life next winter. So they had the shelter, they had the heat source, they had the clothes. But none of that matters if you starve before spring arrives. And their solution to that problem was honestly kind of disgusting. Here's the thing about surviving winter. Growing food, that's the easy part. Keeping it from rotting before you can eat it, that's where most civilizations failed miserably. Vikings figured out something that took the rest of Europe centuries to understand. Bacteria can work for you, not just against you. Lactofermentation was their secret weapon. They'd pack cabbage, fish, or dairy into containers, let specific bacteria colonize the food, and those bacteria would produce acids that killed everything else trying to spoil it. No refrigeration needed, no canning technology required, just chemistry doing the heavy lifting. And Skyr? Forget that smooth, sweet stuff you buy at the grocery store today. Viking Skyr was dense, sour, and packed with 11% protein. One batch could last an entire winter without going bad. My grandmother used to make something similar, and I'll be honest, the taste took some getting used to, but it kept people alive when fresh food was a distant memory. Now let's talk about hakarl, fermented shark. Sounds disgusting, right? Well, it was disgusting. Still is. But here's why it existed. Greenland shark flesh contains toxic levels of ammonia. Eat it fresh and you'll die. But fermentation neutralizes that poison, turning something deadly into something merely awful tasting. Vikings weren't eating it for fun. They were eating it because wasting protein meant death. Sauerkraut-style vegetables did something equally clever. They provided vitamin C throughout the winter, preventing scurvy. Other Northern Europeans didn't crack this code for centuries. Vikings just stumbled into nutritional science while trying not to starve. And nothing got wasted. Nothing. The whey left over from making Skyr, acidic enough to preserve meat and fish for months. Every byproduct became another preservation tool because throwing something away was basically throwing away your survival chances. The average household needed roughly 400 pounds of preserved food per person to make it from October through April. But fermenting food only works if you can store it properly. And Vikings didn't just stack barrels in a corner and hope for the best. They engineered storage systems directly into the frozen ground itself. Here's the thing about Viking food preservation. They didn't just ferment everything. They also turned the frozen ground itself into a year-round refrigerator. Vikings dug ice cellars below the frost line where temperatures stayed constant around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer, winter, didn't matter. The earth maintained that temperature like nature's thermostat. My grandfather had a root cellar that worked the same way, kept his apples crisp until March. The Vikings figured this out 1,000 years earlier, but cold storage was just one trick. Dried fish, called stockfish, hung in open-air structures where freezing winds stripped out every drop of moisture. No machines, no electricity, just Arctic air doing the work for free. And this stuff lasted 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years, that's longer than some marriages I know. Now here's where it gets clever. Grain storage was a nightmare because mold could destroy an entire winter's food supply overnight. Their solution? Underground pits lined with birch bark. The bark released natural antifungal compounds that prevented rot. They were basically inventing food science without knowing the chemistry behind it. Smoking meat wasn't about making fancy bacon either. The phenols in wood smoke created an antimicrobial coating that preserved meat for over a year. Function over flavor every single time. And salt? Forget about it. Salt was so scarce in Scandinavia that Vikings sometimes traded slaves for it. 1 pound of salt could mean the difference between your family surviving winter or not. Makes our complaints about grocery prices seem a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Then there's the timing. Vikings slaughtered livestock in late autumn specifically, so fresh meat froze immediately. No spoilage window, no racing against bacteria. The cold did the preservation work the moment the animal died. Every single method connected back to one obsession, getting through October to April without starving. But storing food was only half the battle. All those preservation techniques meant nothing if you couldn't keep warm while eating it. And heating a longhouse through 6 months of darkness required a fuel strategy that consumed their entire summer. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Surviving winter wasn't just about building good walls or wearing warm clothes. You needed fuel, lots of it. And getting that fuel was basically a full-time summer job. Vikings burned 15 to 20 pounds of wood per hour to keep a longhouse warm. Per hour. Do the math on 6 months of winter, and you'll understand why these people spent their summers swinging axes instead of relaxing on beaches. But here's where it gets interesting. Not every Viking lived near forests. Iceland, barely any trees. Greenland, even worse. So they adapted in ways that would make modern survivalists take notes. They burned dried animal dung, peat cut from bogs, even bones. Whatever combustible material existed, they figured out how to use it. Desperation is the mother of invention, and these folks were desperate every single winter. Driftwood became so valuable in Iceland that laws literally specified which farmer owned logs washing up on shore. We argue about parking spots. They argued about sticks floating in from the ocean. Different priorities when freezing is on the table. Now, my favorite part? The long fire technique. Instead of stacking logs in a pile and watching them burn fast, Vikings laid them lengthwise in a trench. One loading provided 12-plus hours of steady heat. That's genius. You could actually sleep through the night without someone waking up to feed the fire every 2 hours. Charcoal production ran all summer, too. Regular wood wasn't hot enough for smithing metal, so they spent months turning timber into charcoal in covered pits. Dirty, smoky, miserable work. But without tools, you don't survive anything. The numbers are honestly insane. A typical household needed 40 to 50 cords of wood annually. That meant clearing roughly 4 acres of forest every single year just for heat. Not cooking, not building, just not freezing. And they hadn't even started gathering food yet. Speaking of food, here's a question that might keep you up at night. What happens when you've got the heat figured out, the fuel stacked, the clothes made, but you're still trapped inside for months with 30 other people? 3 to 4 hours of daylight, that's all Vikings had during deep winter. Your morning commute takes longer than their entire sun exposure for the day. So how do you function when darkness runs the show? You don't fight it. You redesign everything. First thing to go was normal sleep. Vikings didn't do the 8-hour block we're obsessed with. They slept in chunks throughout the day and night. Nap when you're tired, work when you're not. Honestly, sleep researchers now say this polyphasic approach might actually be healthier than our modern schedule. Vikings stumbled onto good sleep science 1,000 years early. But here's what surprised me. Winter wasn't downtime. It was actually their most productive season for skilled work. Think about it. Summer meant farming, fishing, raiding, building. No time for detailed craftsmanship. But winter, you're stuck inside anyway. Smiths hammered out weapons by firelight. Women wove intricate textiles. Wood carvers created the detailed pieces we see in museums today. All that famous Viking artistry made during the dark months. Then there's entertainment. Those epic sagas weren't just bedtime stories. They served real purposes. Family histories got memorized, legal codes passed down, navigation routes preserved. No books, no writing for most people. Your brain was the hard drive, and winter was backup season. And the isolation created real problems. 30 people, one building, 6 months. The tension must have been unbearable. Icelandic law actually had special provisions for violence during winter confinement. Attack your housemate in January. Worse punishment than the same crime in July. They knew cabin fever was basically inevitable. Board games like Hnefatafl became essential. Not leisure, mental survival, something to focus competitive energy on besides strangling your brother-in-law. The wildest part? Frozen rivers and snowpacked ground actually made travel easier than summer mud. Winter was peak trading season. Those conditions everyone thinks trap Vikings inside, they turned them into highways, so they mastered darkness, kept minds sharp, and prevented murder through board games and storytelling, but none of that mattered if sickness hit, and their medical solutions were way more scientific than you'd expect. Now here's where Vikings surprise everyone. We assume ancient medicine was just superstition and prayer, waving herbs around while hoping for the best. But Vikings had actual techniques that worked, and we can prove it. Take honey, they slathered it on wounds like we use antibiotic ointment. Sounds like grandmother nonsense, right? Except modern labs confirmed honey genuinely kills bacteria. The sugar concentration literally dehydrates microbes to death. Vikings didn't know the chemistry, but they noticed people stopped dying from infected cuts. Good enough. Then there's sphagnum moss. This stuff grows everywhere in Scandinavia, and Vikings packed it into wounds constantly. Here's the thing. That exact same moss got used by medics in World War I. Why? It releases iodine naturally and absorbs 20 times its weight in fluid. So a Viking field dressing from 900 AD worked on the same principles as military medicine 1,000 years later. My personal favorite is the onion soup test. If a warrior took a gut wound, they'd feed him strong onion broth. Then they'd smell around the injury. If onion scent leaked out, congratulations, you've got a perforated intestine. Don't waste resources on a dead man walking. Brutal? Absolutely. But also genuinely diagnostic medicine. And it gets more sophisticated. Vikings fermented birch bark into solutions containing salicylic acid. That's the active ingredient in aspirin. They were brewing primitive painkillers in wooden bowls. Childbirth happened in the warmest section of the longhouse, attended by experienced women who'd done this dozens of times. The survival rates? Actually comparable to fancy European hospitals in the 1700s. Experience and warmth beat expensive doctors with dirty hands. But here's what's really clever. They understood mental health mattered during endless darkness. Steam baths weren't just about getting clean. The heat therapy, the social gathering, the ritual elements, all of it fought the psychological weight of winter isolation. Makes you wonder, right? If Vikings figured out practical medicine for bodies and minds, how did they organize entire communities to survive together? Because individual tricks mean nothing if your neighbors let you starve. Here's the thing about Vikings that nobody talks about. They weren't rugged individualists. That's a modern myth we project onto them. The reality? They were obsessive community planners. Before winter even started, entire regions gathered for thing assemblies. And no, they weren't just boring town meetings. These gatherings existed specifically to settle disputes. That argument about your neighbor's goat eating your barley? Solved now. That blood feud brewing between two families? Resolved immediately. Why the urgency? Because fighting during winter isolation could kill everyone in a household. One grudge, one stabbing, one death meant one less person gathering firewood, tending animals, or keeping watch. Communities literally couldn't afford drama when survival was at stake. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Wealthy households weren't just expected to help poorer neighbors, they were legally obligated to host midwinter feasts. This wasn't charity, it was survival insurance. Feed your struggling neighbors in December, and they'll lend you their oxen in March when yours dies. The entire system ran on reciprocity. And the punishments for breaking this social contract? Brutal. Exile during winter was basically a death sentence. Icelandic laws actually treated autumn banishment as more severe than the same punishment given in spring. Get kicked out in October? You're dead. Get kicked out in April? You might make it to another settlement. Then there's the fostering system. Vikings regularly sent their children to live with other families, not because they didn't love their kids, quite the opposite. Your child in another household created an unbreakable bond. That family wouldn't let yours starve because your kid was eating at their table. I think about my own neighborhood sometimes. My neighbors and I barely wave at each other. Vikings would have considered us suicidal. Farmers within walking distance formed mutual aid networks, sharing food and fuel during shortages. Blood feuds got postponed until spring by social agreement. Vengeance wasn't worth freezing to death over. This cooperative survival system worked brilliantly, but community still needed one more thing to thrive. They needed boats, and those boats did way more than just sail. Now here's something that surprised me when I first learned it. Viking longships weren't just for raiding and trading, they were portable survival kits. Think about it. You're a crew of 30 men caught in a winter storm, miles from any settlement. What do? You drag that ship ashore, flip it upside down, and suddenly you've got a shelter. The curved hull that cut through waves, now it's shedding snow and wind. Genius. But getting that hull to survive freezing water in the first place required serious summer prep. Vikings spent months burning pine roots in covered pits to extract tar. Messy work. Smelled awful. My garage smells bad after an oil change. These guys were basically running industrial operations with sticky black goo everywhere. But that tar kept water out of the wood, which kept crews alive when temperatures dropped, and they planned for disaster. Built right into the ship's frame were watertight compartments stuffed with emergency rations, dried fish, preserved meat, enough to survive being stranded for days. These weren't optimists hoping for smooth sailing. These were realists who'd watched friends die. The versatility didn't stop there. Oars doubled as tent poles. Rigging became framework for shelters. The sail, instant roof and walls. Every single piece of a Viking ship had a backup survival function. Nothing wasted. Navigation during winter was its own challenge. Forget stars. Cloud cover hid them for weeks. So Vikings read wave patterns, tracked bird flight paths, followed whale migrations. They essentially turned the ocean itself into a map. But here's what really mattered. Getting home before autumn freeze wasn't optional. A ship trapped in ice could crack apart as water expanded in the wood. Your family's most valuable possession destroyed. Your livelihood gone. Your ability to fish, trade, or escape enemies finished. So they raced the seasons every single year. Leave too late for a raid? Risk everything. Stay too long trading? Same deal. These boats represented everything. Freedom, wealth, survival itself, and Vikings treated them accordingly. Because in their world, your ship wasn't just transportation, it was life insurance.